Thank you, Roma Olvera. Now, many of you may think that we called in a Broadway star who was between gigs. Roma grew up in this church, and she's home visiting her mother, Martha, and I found out she could sing, and don't let me know you can sing. And so I prevailed upon her. Thank you so much, and we're looking forward to hearing from her again. And a wonderful song. Children will listen. In fact, speaking of children, I've got 2 online right now. 2 out of 5. You know, that's not too bad. I guess my daughter wanted to get in on the lunch lottery. Thank you. I think hear a phone going off. Can we turn off all of our phones? Thank you. Thank you. And Peter, thank you for that magnificent reading. This is one of those texts that doesn't need preaching. I mean, you heard the words. It just speaks for itself. And I'll say, this is not the lectionary, okay? This is one I chose because it seemed to fit the moment. And for the benefit of our Zoom audience and our recording, I'm just going to share a few of the verses from our passage from 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 11 through 18. These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands to make implements of war. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And on that day, you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you on that day. I'd like to preach to us for a few moments from the theme, the thing about kings. The thing about kings. The thing about kings is that there is no one to check them. There is no one to restrain them, to control them. They control everything and everyone. You know the saying, it's good to be king. But Israel wanted a king. They wanted to be like other nations, to be strong like other nations. They believed that having a king would make them more effective in war. And they wouldn't have to consult and coordinate with the 12 different tribes before taking action. A king could act unilaterally. This was the beginning of Hebrew nationalism. Before this, they were 12 tribes that all got along and were led by judges in each tribe. Judges who would adjudicate the differences among the people, and the judges would come together, and the head judge was Samuel, and they lived that way in covenant with God and cooperation with the other tribes. But their demand for a king upset Samuel. He said, have I not led you well enough? Well, they told him the truth. He said, Samuel, you're old. And his sons had taken up the office of judge, and they were corrupt. And so their response was to demand a king. Today, our country is suffering from a similar kind of illusion. It's not Hebrew nationalism. It is called Christian nationalism. Well, Christian nationalism is kind of its nickname. The full name is white Christian nationalism, if you want to get real about it. It is a strange animal because for all of its talk about God and Jesus, it actually worships power and clamors for a strong man to rule over them rather than to be guided by their faith in Jesus and their professed love of God. Many people see this phenomenon of Christian nationalism as a recent distortion of a long-standing and innocuous civil religion that put "In God We Trust" on our money and added "One nation under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. But in the book, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, Professor Philip S. Gorski and Samuel Perry make a compelling case that white Christian nationalism has been around from the beginning and even before the founding of this nation itself. They write, "For it was around 1690 that racism, apocalypticism, and nationalism first fused into a deep story. It's important to emphasize that things could have turned out differently had some of the colonists acted differently. You could say that in 1690, we lost an alternative vision for life in the New World, one in which the natives and the colonists would live in concord or even in community, one in which the line between white and black did not yet fully and irrevocably correspond to that between freedom and bondage, and one in which there was room not only for non-Protestants, but also for non-Christians. In other words, it didn't have to be this way. We had a chance to build this country differently. 4 years ago, when we had the George Floyd protests, I gave a speech in which I marked all the different inflection points where this nation could have resolved its racial problems. And at each point that they failed to resolve the racial dilemma, the cost of solving it kept getting higher. And I'll just recite the one. You've heard of the 1619 Project? How many of you have heard of the 1619 Project? For those of you who haven't, look it up, 1619. In 1619 at Jamestown Colony, which was before Plymouth Colony, Jamestown, Virginia, a Dutch slave ship, or rather a Portuguese slave ship, was pirated by some Dutch pirates and landed in Virginia. And the cargo on that ship were 19 Africans who had been captured and were being brought to be enslaved in the New World. Now, when they encountered the colony, the Jamestown settlement, the Englishmen in Jamestown were going to buy the contracts of these indentured servants, because that's all they had in Jamestown until then, indentured servants. So they said, oh, okay, we've got 19 more indentured servants. And for indentured servants, many people came from England and Ireland and the European countries in that way. They would get passage to the New World. They would work for 7 years. And at the end of their indenture, they would get a sum of money to start a life free in the New World. The settlers at Jamestown could have done that with the Africans on that ship, and we would never have had slavery or the problems that have resulted from it. That was just one of the points in which we could have done something different, and of course that was the cheapest, and it just kept getting more expensive from there. The professors go on. The death of that vision went hand in hand with the birth of a new vision, dominated by white Protestant men and defined in opposition to red savagery, black bondage, and Roman popery. Within that order, race, religion, and nationalism were to be aligned by force if necessary. That is the spirit of 1690, the spirit of white Christian nationalism. This white Christian nationalism has now passed for mainline Christianity, or it started in 1690 and became what was known as mainline Christianity right up to the 1960s. So we didn't call it white Christian nationalism, it just was that. Mainline Christianity was carrying on the vision of 1690, carrying on the spirit of 1690. And so mainline Christianity passed for white Christian nationalism right up to the 1960s, when the moral crisis of the church, brought on by the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the women's rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, and the environmental crisis, led many good Christians to leave the church in order to save their own souls. You will recall that Jimmy Carter had to resign from his Baptist church deacon board because they did not allow blacks to be deacons in that church. And he would ultimately leave his Baptist church altogether because they would not ordain women. So what was left after the mass exodus from the mainline church? What was left was a reactionary movement within white Protestantism and conservative Catholicism that doubled down on their heritage as the spiritual backbone of the nation. White evangelicalism displaced the anemic remnant of mainline Protestantism and forged a heretofore unthinkable alliance with their conservative Roman Catholic co-religionists over their newfound alliance in opposition to women's reproductive rights. This marriage of convenience could only go public after the white evangelicals abandoned their open campaign against racial integration and school desegregation in the 1960s and 70s. That was the well-known other side of the coin of white supremacy. But even this mighty alliance could not prevail against the rising tide of freedom that would not crest for another 50 years. Remember, we talked about this pain of the last 60 years that they've been feeling, and we've been feeling it for 6 months. Well, the crest has happened, and their moment has arrived. Persistence and the perversion of democratic principles have finally paid off. And within just the recent decade, many of the rights that were thought to be secure in law and in our society have been and are being overturned by the resurgent movement of white Christian nationalism. It has not been a smooth takeover. The first effort was aborted by the election of 2020. And despite their rebellion on January 6th of 2021, there remained in the Congress enough small d Democrats that even the sitting vice president, who was in charge of counting the votes, had enough conscience to resist the ugly face of white Christian nationalism and declare in favor of the opposing party. He was and remains the last small d Democrat in the Republican Party. But 4 years later, they have returned with a vengeance and with vengeance, and with a roadmap to permanent power that will likely take generations to undo. It is no coincidence that many of the laws that they are resurrecting to accomplish their evil deeds come from a time when white Christian nationalism was unchallenged. Now, many ask, make America great again? Well, when was America great? What is the era of American history that they consider to be that moment when America was great? Now, many will immediately respond, oh, they must be talking about the 1950s. That's often pointed to as the time of American preeminence, fresh off the victory in World War II and with an expanding middle class when America was indeed great. But if you said the 1950s, you'd be wrong. You'd be wrong by about 100 years. You see, it is actually the 1850s that they consider to be when America was great. 1845, to be precise. That was when the real era of white Christian nationalist dominance. Yes, before the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, as some say, and after John L. O'Sullivan first wrote of, quote, our greatness and the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. Providence was the polite word for God back then. That's when America was great. America was great when you could raise a posse and go across state lines and return black people who had escaped slavery to the white people who had enslaved them. You see, that was the origin of the Posse Comitatus Act. But after the Civil War, the federal army forces became the de facto police in the South to enforce the newly enacted civil rights laws that ensured that black people could vote. So it was after they lost the Civil War that they flipped the script and voted for the Posse Comitatus Act to prevent federal forces from engaging in local law enforcement. See, we're all upset about that right now. But just think back, it was the 1950s when federal troops went back south to enforce federal laws ensuring equal opportunity for education and voting rights. And now, in a perversion of history, as Sonia Sharp wrote in the Los Angeles Times on Friday, in recent weeks, the Trump administration has used constitutional maneuvers invented to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act to justify using troops to round up immigrants. Let that sink in for a moment. They have studied their history, and so should we. The traditional Republican coalition, think Reagan or George W., is described by Professor Gorski as a chair with 4 legs, those legs being neocon hawks, pro-market neoliberals, religious traditionalists, and a concealed 4th leg of white supremacy and anti-black racism. You'll remember Ronald Reagan's welfare queen references. Now, this chair supported both Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush for 2 full terms, often with a Congress to support them. Gorski continues his analysis to this current moment. He writes, These legs were always a bit wobbly. Do Christian family values really go together with neoliberal economic policies? How can growth of racial inequality be reconciled with biblical concerns for social justice? Then Donald Trump sat down in the chair, and it began to splinter under his weight. Christian family values couldn't bear the weight of the porn star president, close quote. The Republican Party has been replaced by the cult of Trump and the America Firsters. Gorski opines that, quote, some American Firsters would in fact be quite happy to replace the chair with a throne. You see, that's the thing about kings. Once they sit down, it's really, really, really hard to get them out. That's what the 4th of July will celebrate. The day that the 13 tribes of the United States would cast off their king and be ruled by covenant and cooperation among the states and among the peoples of those states. Gorski warns us, we must recognize that white Christian nationalism is a threat. Nationalism is a threat to true patriotism, which honors dissent and allows correction. And white Christianity is a threat to true Christianity, which honors all people and understands that justice is what love looks like in public, to quote that woke professor from Union Theological Seminary, Cornel West, the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice, with whom I had the honor to study under when I was in seminary. Or could you tell? Christianity is at stake in our world right now. White Christian nationalism is a wolf in lion's clothing. And we must stand up for the good shepherd who leaves the 99 to seek the one lost sheep. We must rise up for the compassionate Christ who forgives, restores, and rescues those who are sick and poor and stranger and even enemy. We must rise up for our faith and forever proclaim that God and only God is my King. Let the people of God say, amen.